Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I stood beneath a banner that sagged just slightly from the weight of too much tape and too little care. The word congratulations, glittering across it like the family's pride, had been glued onto fabric for rent. Dad held his glass high, his shoulders squared as though he were addressing a stadium instead of a rented hall filled with folding chairs, cheap catered meatballs, and the same cousins who still judged each other by who got a new car first in high school. He cleared his throat and spoke with the grandness of a man who had waited his whole life to deliver a single line that would crown one child and quietly bury the other. "To my one true success," he said, his voice booming across the room. The crowd erupted with laughter, the kind that carries no joy but plenty of compliance, because nobody ever risked being the one who didn't laugh at Richard Carter's jokes. I kept my smile fixed like it had been stapled to my face. My brother Evan grinned with all the ease of someone used to applause, while I stood off to the side, holding a plate of food I had no interest in, reminding myself to breathe evenly so the heat in my chest wouldn't show. I had long accepted my role as the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who would nod along and fill in the spaces where family pride didn't quite stretch far enough. But Mark, my husband, was not wired for silent endurance. He had spent years watching me take the hits, swallowing my protests while the family congratulated itself on Evan's scholarships, his job interviews, his every minor accomplishment, as though I hadn't been covering the shortfalls, patching the gaps, wiring the money that kept the lights on and the health insurance paid. So when Dad made his toast and the laughter rose, Mark set his drink down with the kind of deliberation that makes even a crowded room tilt toward silence. He reached into his jacket and slid a stack of neatly printed papers onto the white plastic table between the cake and the punch bowl. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Really?" he said, his tone calm but cutting enough to slice through the chatter. "Because you've been living off her deposits for years." The laughter snapped off like a switch had been thrown. The DJ froze halfway through cueing another song. Cousin Tara leaned forward, trying to look casual, but clearly desperate not to miss the show. Evan's grin faltered, and Mom clutched at the coffee urn with both hands like it might save her from drowning. Dad let out a short laugh, the reflexive bark of a man who always laughed first in order to control the room. But the laugh died before it reached his eyes. He looked at me, not at Mark, and his face tried on the expression of a man misunderstood. "Julia," he said. He never called me Julia unless he wanted to sound official. "This isn't what you think." The papers sat there in the open, highlighted sections glowing under the overhead lights like evidence spread out in a courtroom. Mark tapped his finger against one page with all the finality of a gavel. Utilities, insurance premiums, club dues, even part of a boat slip. All coming from a joint account Julia opened in college, when she trusted you enough to share access. You called it temporary, but temporary seems to have lasted more than a decade. A ripple went through the room, nervous murmurs punctuated by the scrape of chairs as people leaned closer without wanting to look like they were leaning closer. I saw the bartender at the far end of the room swipe Dad's card for another round of drinks, then hesitate, frown, and shake his head. Declined. The whisper carried back to us faster than the music could cover it, and Dad's face tightened as the truth landed in waves. I had frozen the account that very morning, quietly, with the same clinical precision I used to balance every spreadsheet at work. It had felt like sealing a door I should never have left unlocked. And now, right there in front of every cousin, every aunt and uncle who had ever praised Evan's talent and brushed aside my own work, Dad was holding a useless piece of plastic that exposed everything. He set the card on the table, careful and quiet, like a man who knew noise would only make it worse. "Do you really want to do this here?" he asked, but he wasn't looking at Mark anymore. His eyes drilled into me, demanding loyalty through glare alone. "Because those deposits weren't what you think." I wasn't stealing. I was safeguarding. For you. I tilted my head, my voice steady even though my pulse pounded like a drumline in my ears. "Great," I said. "Then why don't you tell everyone exactly how that worked?" For once, Dad didn't have words ready. Mom fumbled in her purse, her hands trembling. She pulled out a folded paper, yellowed at the edges, as though she had carried it for years waiting for the moment it might be needed. Her voice shook when she spoke. "Richard, if you won't explain, then I will." She unfolded the paper, and there was my name written across the top in Dad's unmistakable block letters. The room leaned in, the air stretching thinner, and I realized with a strange clarity that the story I thought I knew was about to split open in front of everyone. I did not expect a single sheet of paper to feel heavier than a box of old trophies, yet when Mom unfolded that yellowed note with my name spread across the top in Dad's no-nonsense block letters, the room seemed to tilt. Because even though I did not know the contents yet, I recognized the posture of a promise written in ink precisely to be pulled out in a moment like this, a theatrical gesture meant to dress Dad as devotion. And while my relatives craned their necks with the polite greed, families reserve for other people's secrets, I kept my eyes on the handwriting and let myself remember the origin of the joint account that had followed me like a stray dog that everyone swore belonged to someone else. Back in college, when rent ate hope and the campus bank sold security with a free mug, Dad had convinced me that adding him to a brand new account was the smart thing, strictly for emergencies, nothing more permanent than training wheels. And because I was 19 and eager to be responsible in a way that made other people relax, I agreed, telling myself that shared access was a vote of confidence rather than a slow siphon that would, over the years, recategorize my boundaries as a family utility, and even now I can still taste the exact flavor of that first rationalization, how it coded every later withdrawal with the phrase we used like a lullaby, temporary, until temporary matured into habit and habit matured into entitlement. The paper in Mom's hand said he would make it right, an IOU dressed as virtue with no figure, no schedule, and no friction except the assumption that the future would eventually align around Dad's intentions. And while cousins traded glances and Evan's smile failed to reassemble itself, I felt something steadier than anger slide into place, the sense that this could be untangled if I stopped treating politeness like a mortgage, which is how, 2 days later, Mark and I sat across from a bank manager named Elena in a glass-walled room that made secrets look childish, and listened to her explain with the gentleness of someone who has seen 100 versions of this exact story that what had happened to me was common, not because it was right, but because it was easy, and that ease is the most effective thief in any household. Elena turned her monitor toward me and walked line by line through autopays dressed in vague labels that had never touched my address or my life, and because she did not flinch, I learned not to either. And we revoked authorizations with a sequence of clicks that felt like closing windows during a storm, replaced the sleepy yes that had been my default with explicit no. Signed forms that unbraided our names from accounts that had used my credit as a scaffold for someone else's hobbies, and while a part of me grieved the years I had been dutiful in the wrong direction, another part enjoyed the quiet competence of it, the way the pen moved like a small blade cutting free fabric that had been snagged for too long. On speaker, I called the insurance that had treated my signature like a neighborhood gate code, and I called the marina where I learned more about slip fees than any land mammal should know, and I called a club office where a cheerful receptionist, who probably thought she was doing an innocent task, attempted to verify my address for monthly dues I had apparently been funding for seasons, and by the time I hung up, a stack of confirmation numbers sat in front of me like little notarized apologies, which did not erase the past, but at least turned the present toward sanity, and when Elena mentioned, almost as an afterthought but with clear intent, that people who have become accustomed to other people's money sometimes rush to open a new line before the door finishes closing, I promised her that if any alert arrived I would call her first. Not because I expected an ambush, but because I finally understood that vigilance is not paranoia when history keeps trying to repeat itself. When we left the bank, I mailed certified letters to the house and, with a small, deliberate flourish that balanced pettiness with purpose, to Dad's golf club mailbox where gossip travels faster than sound, each envelope containing dates, amounts, and a request for a mediated conversation that made it clear I preferred solutions to spectacle, and although a younger version of me would have softened the language with a joke, I let the letters be plain on purpose, because plainness can be its own kind of confrontation when a family has learned to hide behind weathered scripts about loyalty and sacrifice, and if this counted as revenge then it was the sober kind, the kind that sets the record straight without setting the place on fire. That night, while the dishwasher hummed and Mark read in the chair he refuses to replace, my phone lit up with Mom's name and a photo message that arrived like a pebble dropping through calm water, and when I opened it, I saw the blur of a manila folder on our old dining table, my name on a tab I did not remember creating, and a document beneath it whose layout looked disturbingly familiar. The boxes and lines and signature fields shaped exactly like the credit forms I had spent the afternoon dismantling. Mom's text said, "Your name is on something else. I do not understand it. He said it was for you," which landed in my chest like a warning siren wrapped in a lullaby, and as I pinched the screen to zoom in, the photo sharpened just enough for me to see a version of my signature curved across a line I had never approached with a pen, beautiful and false and waiting, like a door someone had already opened in my name. The photo Mom sent sat on my screen like a lit fuse, and while Mark leaned forward with the patience of someone who knows that panic wastes energy we would soon need, I opened the family group chat that pretends at unity with a nickname and a collage banner, only to watch the bubbles multiply and split as cousins who have never asked about my life suddenly discovered an appetite for details that they framed as concern, with Aunt Lila forwarding a breathless thread of quotes about forgiveness. That felt like coupons being waived at a full-price bill, and Evan hovering in that limbo where he types and deletes and types again because he wants to be a good brother without being a bad son, which is a neat trick no one has ever actually pulled off in our house. I answered none of them, because some theaters do not deserve audiences, and instead I did the one public thing I knew how to do without sounding like a siren, posting a calm, exact note on Facebook that described the shape of the problem without sketching faces onto it, where I said that in many families the person who appears least dramatic absorbs the most drama in the form of unasked favors and invasive access, and that while I loved my people with all the complicated geography that word holds, love could no longer be the badge that let other people spend my future, which launched a cascade of private messages from friends and near strangers who told me their own versions of quiet financing. And even though I would have preferred a world where no one recognized what I was describing, the recognition steadied me, because it meant I was not hysterical, I was simply stopping. With the air cleared of performative sympathy, I called Elena and asked for a small conference room with a glass wall and unpadded chairs, a neutral habitat where posture cannot hide behind curtains, and she found a slot that afternoon, which I accepted because the longer a wound stays open the more hands will point at it, and when we arrived, Dad made a show of standing while the rest of us sat, the old coach stance that used to intimidate referees and teenagers, only now it looked like a refusal to accept gravity, and Elena, who does not choreograph her empathy around status, began by reading the bank's definitions in a voice like a metronome, explaining that an authorized user is not an owner, that a joint account is not a family tradition but a legal relationship, and that repayment is not vengeance when unauthorized benefit has occurred, all of which Dad tried to interrupt with the smirk of a man who believes volume can edit policy, but policy, like math, does not blush. Evan spoke next with a softness that probably cost him more courage than shouting would have, admitting that he had known about some of the withdrawals because he had watched bills get paid that did not make sense, and that last year he told Dad to stop because he could not square the version of manhood he wanted with one that ran on his sister's credits, and while his admission landed jagged in the room, I appreciated that he finally placed his weight on the side of the scale that had been hungry for truth, which is why I did not spare Dad the courtesy of pretending we were confused by the paper in Mom's photo, and I asked Elena to pull any account or line where my name had been threaded through without a signature I could own. Revenge, in that moment, did not wear a dramatic coat or carry a speech, because revenge can also arrive as the quiet satisfaction of watching a banker print 3 pages that do not lie. Pages that showed a second credit line opened during a week I was in another city, leading a training that still lives on my calendar, with my name listed as an authorized applicant and a signature that matched the flourish of my hand, but not the pressure points of my writing, a kind of forgery that relies on how women forgive. And when Elena circled the date and looked up with the cool gaze of someone who has shepherded families through more than one winter, I felt the room resize itself around the reality that this was not a misunderstanding, but a pattern dressed as tradition. Mom, who has always tried to hold the fabric of us together even when the seam cuts her fingers, whispered that Dad kept a note for me, something he once called insurance, and that he wanted to make it right when the time was right. A phrase so polished by overuse that it might as well be a pebble, while Dad flexed his hands and asked if we seriously intended to turn a family argument into a legal procedure, and Mark, bless his patience, answered that we had no interest in court or spectacle, only in restoring the borders of a life we both worked hard to afford, which is when Elena folded the printouts, placed them neatly in a folder with my name where it belongs, and said we had two distinct paths, one that involved a formal dispute, a repayment plan, and immediate revocation of every authorization, and another that involved denial, escalation, and the cold relief of strangers deciding outcomes, a fork that did not require drama to be decisive. I chose the first path without raising my voice, because quiet can be a scalpel when you stop using it as a gag, and as we scheduled a follow-up with a mediator who specializes in household financial disentanglements, my phone vibrated with a security alert that flashed across the screen with the blasé cheerfulness of a weather app, informing me that a new credit inquiry had been submitted in my name that very hour by a generic service that masks specific vendors, which made Elena's eyes narrow in a way that reassured me more than any Hallmark blessing, and while Dad opened his mouth to declare coincidence with the confidence of a man who has always mistaken certainty for proof, I let the alert glow between us, a small rectangle of light that turned speculation into atmosphere, and I said we would pause here, because the next move, like ownership and consent, needed to be documented before it was performed. Grace, the mediator Elena recommended with the serene voice of someone who has seen families dress excuses as heirlooms for longer than any of us have been alive, arrived in a soft gray sweater and carried a legal pad that looked humble until she began drawing boxes and arrows with the precision of a surgeon mapping an organ. And while Dad paced with the caged energy of a former coach who still believes momentum can substitute for accountability, she explained that we would not be litigating personalities or rewriting the mythology that had allowed a so-called emergency account to become a private subsidy, because instead we would be drafting terms that respected law, timelines, and the basic dignity of the person who has been footing the invisible bill, which meant me, and although I could feel the prickle of guilt that women are taught to wear like a favorite scarf whenever they say no in a complete sentence, I kept my mouth steady and my spine tall, because once you say the rules out loud, there is a small miracle in how quickly manipulation stops sounding like love. Grace invited us to speak in full paragraphs rather than in jabs, a mercy for which I will always be grateful, and she began by listing every account where my name had been braided in without consent or comprehension, then moved through the calendar like a patient teacher, reading dates, describing transactions, and asking Dad to acknowledge with his own words that the money moving through those pipes had not been his to treat as a family faucet, and although he kept reaching for charm like a pocket knife, the blade never opened, because charm works on narrative but not on ledgers, and when he tried to tell a story about sacrifice and hard years, and the way real men provide even when the math does not add up, Grace looked at him with the kind of gentle fatigue that only very firm people possess and replied that provision without permission is not generosity, it is consumption dressed for church. We built the plan like carpenters assembling a frame that would hold even if the weather turned foul, with immediate revocation of all authorizations, a freeze on every dormant line that might try to wake up and bite, automatic fraud alerts routed to my phone and to Elena's office, and a repayment schedule divided into monthly installments that were not ruinous, but would be felt in the places where it matters for learning, while Mark, who understands interests like other people understand recipes, calculated a modest sum to acknowledge the years my credit had been used as collateral for hobbies and dues and repairs that never touched my door, and although a version of me wanted to waive that piece to prove I was not cruel, I let the number stay because I am done paying extra to appear nice. When Dad balked at the repayment ledger and muttered about insult, I reminded him, perhaps more sharply than the saintly version of me would have preferred, that insult is what happens when the bill finally arrives and the person who ate the meal protests the price. And while Mom winced as if the word meal contained poison, she also nodded in that small private way she keeps for moments when truth makes her braver than her habit for peacekeeping, and in that moment I chose the kind of revenge that does not burn a house but does, very quietly, turn on all the lights, by asking the marina for documentation showing how the boat had been titled, which returned a tidy file with my credit history flagged as proof of stability during a season when Dad needed leverage, a choice that was technically clever and ethically shabby, and when Grace explained that a lien is available for precisely such situations. I watched Dad's shoulders drop a fraction, the first time all afternoon he looked less like a storm and more like a man who has finally felt rain. Because I am equal parts soft-hearted and theatrical, I also brought a box to Evan's dinner that evening, wrapped in plain paper with a card that said nothing except love. And inside the box sat a framed copy of the first tuition wire I sent during the semester. He found himself suspended between promise and probation, the memo line preserved like a fossil, "We will cover this, kiddo." And beneath the glass I tucked a small typed tag that read, "From your family's invisible fund, proud of you anyway." Which landed like a joke with a tail, because he laughed first and then his face tightened into something older than triumph, and he hugged me with the awkward sincerity of a man who realizes the ladder he climbed had rung someone else paid for. A gesture that I know some viewers will judge as manipulative, yet for me it was a label more than a weapon, a way to say the truth without shouting at a full restaurant. Back at the table with Grace the next afternoon, after Mark had initialed the appendices and Elena had placed copies in a folder with my name printed clean and centered, we reached the point where signatures make talk into fact, and Dad, perhaps sensing that his choice was between dignity now and humiliation later, signed the schedule with a jaw so tight I worried the enamel would crack, then tried to pretend magnanimity by announcing that he would start with a generous first payment to show goodwill, a theater flourish that would have worked on most of our extended family, but here it only sat on the page like excess punctuation, and while I wanted to feel triumphant, I instead felt something closer to gravity. The sensation of a planet resuming its proper orbit after spending too long tilting toward a star that treated warmth like an entitlement. I was ready to stand, to gather my folder and my breath, when Mom reached into her tote and slid a plain envelope across the table with the cautious finality of someone placing a match near dry kindling. And she said that before I decided to hate the entire past, she wanted me to read what she had found in Dad's desk years ago and kept because she believed in better timing, and inside I discovered a confirmation letter from a savings bank I do not use, written in an older logo and listing an account solely in Dad's name with my name set as beneficiary, seated with deposits made in amounts too small to brag about yet persistent enough to suggest intention rather than accident, and in the margins, in the stiff confidence of his lettering, Dad had written insurance for you, which did not absolve anything yet did not accuse nothing either, so that when my phone buzzed with a new notification promising that a first repayment had already arrived in my account with the subject line "First Step," I felt a hesitant relief widening in my ribs, followed by a second buzz from the fraud service that announced a fresh inquiry in my name had been attempted that morning through a generic vendor aggregator. And the room stilled in a way that told me every person at the table understood what the next question would be, while Dad adjusted his watch with theatrical care and said nothing at all as I lifted my eyes and asked, with more poise than I felt, whether anyone wanted to explain why the past we were closing kept trying to pick the lock. The house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, though no amount of citrus could erase the residue of tension clinging to every corner, and as we gathered around the table for what was meant to be a closing conversation, I felt the strange sensation of stepping into a room that had not changed in years while realizing that I had, and the mismatch between those two truths pressed against my chest like a weight I refused to carry any longer. Dad wore his polo shirt like armor, Mom arranged store-bought cookies on a tray with the choreography of habit, and Grace laid out the final documents with the composure of someone accustomed to watching families disintegrate in slow motion before they agree to reassemble in some slightly altered shape, while Mark leaned at my side, steady, not theatrical, a silent reminder that my life existed outside of this drama, that I was not only the role they had written for me. Grace spoke first, her tone neither indulgent nor cruel, reminding us that we had arrived at a structure of a repayment schedule, a fraud dispute, the permanent revocation of my authorizations, and she explained that while signatures close papers, only behavior closes wounds, and therefore what happened next would not be a legal matter, but a matter of whether this family wanted to continue functioning as kin or merely as strangers with familiar faces. Dad stayed standing longer than anyone else, as though gravity was negotiable, then sat abruptly, folding his hands in front of him in a way that looked practiced, and when he finally spoke, his words came measured but stubborn, insisting that he had provided in ways unseen, that the world kept changing rules, that his intentions had always been protective rather than parasitic. A speech that might have impressed in another setting, but here fell flat against the arithmetic of the printouts. I told him quietly that rules had not changed, only my willingness to let them be ignored, and I watched the first flicker of something not quite surrender cross his face, because beneath all the performance he could recognize truth even if he hated its timing. Mom placed her hand on his sleeve and whispered the words she always resorts to when storms gather, "Say the rest, Richard," and after a long pause, he did, admitting that he had let easy become normal, that he had hidden behind the shield of family loyalty as if that phrase could erase ledgers, that he had grown accustomed to calling my strength his safety net, and while his apology did not erase decades of quiet withdrawals, it softened the sharp edge of my anger, leaving behind something more complicated, a blend of grief and relief that never fits into neat categories. Evan finally broke his silence too, confessing that he had known enough to confront Dad a year earlier, but had retreated into the excuse that I could handle it, and hearing him say it aloud, in front of everyone, stung worse than I expected, because it confirmed that even the sibling I had wanted to protect most had allowed himself to believe in my invincibility as an inexhaustible resource, though his face carried an honesty that suggested this admission cost him dearly, and so I accepted it, with a nod rather than a lecture, because sometimes accountability sounds more powerful than punishment. The documents were signed in a slow, reluctant ceremony, and when Dad slid his pen across the final page, I felt less victory than gravity, the sensation that the universe had been wobbling on its axis and now was finally correcting. Though correction does not guarantee comfort. Grace gathered the papers and reminded us again that boundaries are not betrayals, but forms of service, and then she left with the calm of someone who knows that her work is never truly finished. Because families rarely honor boundaries without first testing every fence they build. I lingered in the kitchen after everyone began drifting toward their coats, staring at the sunlight falling across counters scrubbed too clean, when my phone buzzed twice in quick succession. The first alert announced that a repayment had already been deposited into my account, labeled First Step, which sent a wave of relief through me that felt almost foreign, because I had grown so used to silence instead of reciprocation. The second buzz carried less comfort, a fraud alert flagging a new credit inquiry in my name, processed only hours earlier through a vendor aggregator that hid its true source, and as I stared at the glow of the screen, the optimism of that first deposit soured into suspicion, because a pattern that has lived too long rarely dies quietly. I walked back into the living room, phone in hand, and asked the question without raising my voice, because in this family raising your voice only provided the excuse to dismiss your point. Had anyone tried to open a new line of credit in my name today? The silence that followed was thick enough to hear the tick of the old clock on the wall, and Dad blinked once, twice, before claiming carefully that he had put a stop to the old automation, but could not guarantee every file had been fully extinguished. And while his tone suggested technical oversight, the timing smelled like intention. Mom squeezed his arm, Evan raised his hands and swore he had nothing to do with it, and Mark studied Dad's face with the kind of stillness that turns silence into evidence. I stood there holding my phone, repayment receipt in one hand and fraud alert in the other, torn between relief and suspicion, unsure whether the gesture of restitution marked a genuine turn or just another strategy to keep me tethered. And as the weight of both possibilities pressed against me, I realized that the story would not end neatly in this living room, because families rarely give clean endings. Instead, they leave you with a question that hums like a live wire, a question only time can answer. Had Dad finally chosen to change, or had he simply learned a new way to keep the lock warm while waiting for another chance to open the door I had just closed?